So I want to tell you guys a story about a political asylum seeker from Afghanistan who left during the Soviet invasion and then assimilated into Virginia. She then made her way to Hollywood 20 years later, having never even owned a piece of luggage, and somehow made it onto television post 9/11 and has never played a terrorist or a refugee. That person is me. The story starts in Afghanistan, my motherland. No, not this Afghanistan that you guys see on the news, but this Afghanistan. With its lush landscapes and its mountainous terrain, its rich culture, dating from the birth of Rumi to the Buddhas in Bamyan to epic tribal Kutchi nomads. It also happened to be the motherland of Robert Joffrey, the founder of the Joffrey Ballet. A country that has faced battle after battle, who held the line against the British Army to not be colonized, who has been in an endless loop of war. My home, its victories and losses, I feel wholeheartedly. But it wasn't my journey to remain there, to potentially be married off young, to fight the Taliban, to fight wars. No, my journey was something very different, yet it's remained connected the whole time. The artist in me is generational. My dad was in a Beatles cover band in Kabul in the 1960s. That's my dad on the drums, the fun-time, progressive, musical artist, met my mother, the very religious, wickedly funny, very cultural young woman whose family had some prestige in Kabul. They would sneak around, and my mother ended up pregnant, so a marriage occurred. And my dad took my mom from her well-respected family and threw her into a progressive landslide of American politics and rock and roll. It would be his work at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran translating for U.S. soldiers, which would be why we would have to flee. His life, our lives, now on the line back in Afghanistan. And luckily, our friends at the State Department helped us get out, and we would resettle close to them in affluent Northern Virginia. This is me from the time. Yep, that's all I have. Nothing. No baby photos. No real documents. I don't even know my real birthday. I know what you're thinking. It's a convenient story for an actress. But it's true. I don't think I even knew back then, or even until the last decade or so, what everyone in my family really went through. We see it now, right? The tragedy of Syria, entire countries decimated by war, countless refugees fleeing. Some fear those refugees, some turn those refugees away, turn away someone who is just like me. And no, we didn't have warlords or wars to deal with, but we had outright racism. The Virginia that we moved into didn't have a lot of neighbors like the Cleavers dropping off casseroles. No, they were disgusted at our arrival, insulting my mother's accent, throwing rocks at my older sister and I, telling us to go back to our country. I didn't even know I was different until others pointed it out. I was in grade school, and I can't tell you the kid's name, but he came up to me and asked me if I was in ESL. What's that? I asked. Well, English is a second language. No, I was in gifted and talented. I didn't quite understand why he asked me that. I spoke perfect English, but I felt ashamed. On International Day, I was one of 2 kids that had to highlight her home country. The idea of that terrified me. I had started to become anxious that people would hear my mom speak, that she would bring some sort of a food dish that the kids thought were gross and they would judge me. I was really starting to swim in shame, ashamed of her, ashamed of me. I worked so hard to prove my worth that I went on to win every single award at that school, from Patrol of the Year to the Daughters of the American Revolution Citizenship Award. That's right. This little Afghan girl won an award dedicated to preserving American patriotism. These stories, they were building in me, imprinting onto me, a dual experience at once. I wanted to be proud of everything that my family had endured, while wanting to have the privilege to hide in the whiteness I was surrounded by. I did have a happy place, television. Oh man, TV was everything to me. I learned English and American culture watching TV. It would be my mother's undying love of Dynasty and Peter Jennings, and my father's devotion to comedies and syndication. I devoured TV every day, every show, all 5 channels. Always on the lookout for someone who looked like me. But no. My idea of beauty had become lumped into the shiny blonde locks of my childhood friends and the actresses that I saw on television. I came to think of myself as smart and interesting, but not special enough to be on TV. But there was always this little whisper, this fantasy to see myself in that magical box. And as my family would disintegrate from the pressures of assimilating into a new story and leaving behind the old, that whisper became louder and louder. I graduated from university and went on to pack my mother's suitcase from Kabul. It was missing a wheel. And I bought myself a one-way ticket to Hollywood, having only been on a plane once before, and gave myself 30 days to make it. I had no experience, okay? I wasn't allowed to stay after school. I wasn't allowed to sweat. Nothing where boys might be. That was a part of my very strict cultural upbringing. You see, I wasn't just leaving home. I was leaving behind certain duties that had been imposed onto me at birth, and I didn't want to carry them anymore. I wanted magic. And in 30 days, no less. But it didn't happen in those 30 days, and soon after those 30 days, it was 9/11. And my obscure story of being Afghan, my private despair watching the tiny bits of news covering the ongoing war was no longer. Afghanistan was now 24/7 headline news. There wasn't even a single Afghan on either of those planes, but it didn't matter. Afghanistan was a part of America's darkest day. So there I am in Hollywood trying to make some magic happen. I now have the most notorious country stamped all over my identity. I would walk into auditions trying to get a job, and they would struggle with my name, and I'd go, "Oh, Azita Ghanizada," and they'd go, "Oh, where's that from?" And I would say, "Afghanistan." Silence. I was now what, potentially a terrorist? Did I know any? Thank God I got out. Did the woman look like me? Check her shoes. That was a common joke amongst friends that I would laugh through, ashamed again, all over again, not because of where I was from, but because this was all they knew. My home, its people, now the most feared and misrepresented in the world. Agents, managers, and others suggested that I should change my name. Become something more palatable. After all, you can play Latina or European, just be ambiguous. There isn't anyone like you on television, Azita, and when they are, they're covered from head to toe. I sat with that for a bit. It would have made things easier. I mean, who am I to think? Me? A woman from Afghanistan? Could I make it in Hollywood without abandoning parts of myself? It was my chance to finally hide. And I didn't want to. I didn't even know there would be a calling later in life that would need me standing facing towards my identity, towards the religion I was raised with but hadn't practiced since I was 8. Abandon myself? No, I didn't. But guess what? In spite of all those obstacles, I started to work. And my very first television screen test in 2004 was for Dynasty creator Aaron Spelling. I couldn't believe it. I didn't get that job, but talk about a full circle moment. What? I was so green, no experience, no mentors, but I was making it happen. The casting community rallied around me. Commercials led to guest appearances, led to television pilots, led to one getting picked up, and I became a regular on a US television series. Maybe even the first girl from Afghanistan to do so. I was on billboards, the sides of buses, the tops of taxis, but the best part of all of that was I didn't play a terrorist. I played a hero. I played a young girl from Afghanistan who had family issues not unlike her own. Religion never came into play for my character, and I was never a suspected bad guy. Honestly, it was pretty groundbreaking, and at the time, I didn't even know it. After hitting that personal little marker, I thought the next chapter would be bigger and better, but I was wrong. It was the opposite. The roles that I had never had to bend to, even after 9/11, were coming to me more and more. A lawyer but wear a headscarf, a wife but put on an accent, a good Muslim fighting the bad ones. And look, I get it. I'm an actor, and these are roles that actors play. But something was off. I finally got a television pilot, and the casting directors asked me at the table read if I was ethnic. Huh? Azita Ghanizada. No, of course we know you're ethnic, Azita, but what ethnicity are you? Because you're counted as Caucasian. Well, Afghanistan is in Central and South Asia, but it's also considered the Middle East. You can check the Asian box. I came to find out that through a loophole, all performers that looked Middle Eastern or Arab were counted as white. You mean to tell me I was white this whole time? That's what we call a plot twist. But it was actually a huge roadblock. As diversity became increasingly important, as studies were blasting the lack of representation in Hollywood, our group became invisible. We were too diverse for the white roles and not diverse enough for the diverse roles. The casting directors told me it was because our group didn't have a coalition like the NAACP, advocating for performers' rights. You should go out there, they said. Start one. Demand status. And guess what? I did just that. There was an emergency bubbling up, okay? It wasn't about just me anymore. There was an entire community being profiled, not only by the government, but by Hollywood as well. We had gone from being invisible to overly saturated as dangerous and violent stereotypes. I couldn't not do something. So I founded the MENA Arts Advocacy Coalition that next day, and I started to engage with diversity executives. I figured out how it worked, what the contracts were, what an MOU was. I studied the uptick in hate crimes against our group. I found a test category for a MENA program in the 2020 census. This would be my greatest role to date, one that would take me 3 years to fulfill. But in 2017, along with a couple committed actors and a very engaged SAG-AFTRA, we created the first new casting category in Hollywood in 37 years. Middle Eastern, North African, or MENA became a real thing. Now we have a box, which helps us fight to get out of the box we've been forced into. And it's not just assumption, okay? It's not just how we feel. Last year, my organization, MENA Arts, presented a study. And I'm not going to go into tons of details about the study, but just a couple key highlights. When MENA stories are on television, 78% of the time, we are seen as trained soldiers, tyrants, or terrorists. 78% of the time. 67% of the time, we have an over-exaggerated accent. Being otherized to feed into a paranoia that has had detrimental effects across the globe. The image of nearly 2 billion persons erased into one storyline seen over and over again. Think of it like this. If white men had to play neo-Nazis, slave owners, or mass shooters 80% of the time, of course our perception would be dangerously skewed. Historian Carlos Cortez writes that minorities realize, supported by research, that media influence not only how others view them, but even how they view themselves. So how do you view yourself when you're not even there? Or even worse, when all you're seen as is a terrorist? Current research from the American Academy of Pediatrics states that counter-stereotypes and positive media portrayals lead children to better intergroup attitudes, healthier relationships with others, and greater empathy towards minority groups. Had the young kids at my school had one positive media reference for me, maybe our differences wouldn't have felt so vast. The saying representation matters has instilled resentment in some, but its importance is unmatched. If you go back and watch any film from the 90s, 80s, or before, you're not going to see many women like me up there. You still barely do. In USC Annenberg's recent study, out of the top 100 films in 2018, 92 out of 100 had 0 Middle Eastern North African female characters in them. I have been invisible or tokenized. Invisible or tokenized. Those have been my options. So what do? Well, if you're anything like me and you just love to work, you start your own coalition. You create your own television role models. You create your own box. You teach others when all you wanted to do was get a job that didn't create any more shame for you. And we're getting somewhere, okay? It's gotten better. In the last couple years, we've stepped into a world where Mina Massoud isn't terrorist number one. He's Disney's Aladdin, and he wins the hearts of the masses. And Rami Malek opens one of the biggest biopic films ever and goes on to be the first Arab American to win an Academy Award. That matters. Even the telling and owning of my own story helps release the armor of shame I once knew so well. I am so proud of my mother's accent. It reflects the 5 languages that she speaks, of my rich culture and heritage, of the uniqueness that I get to weave into every room that I walk into. To think, if I could go back to the beginning and tell little me that it'll be okay, that it'll all be worth it, that we will stand proud not just for ourselves, but for all other kids with multisyllabic names who aren't quite the exact flavor we're so often fed. That all the shame was a gift so that you could learn to be this teaching moment and help create a small wave of change. And all of that will happen just to be seen in that magical box. Thank you.